let me ask you something that might be uncomfortable. Think about the last time you felt truly, genuinely at peace. Not the peace you feel after a glass of wine, not the brief calm that comes when you finally put your phone down, not even the fleeting quiet of a Sunday morning before the world starts sending you notifications. I mean real peace, the kind that doesn't dissolve when the traffic is bad, when your boss is unreasonable, when your relationship is fraying at the edges, when you look at your bank account and feel the floor tilt beneath you. The kind that remains when everything around you is actively falling apart. Can you remember that peace? Because here is the uncomfortable truth. Most people, highly educated, emotionally intelligent, spiritually curious people, cannot. They have visited that peace, maybe, in meditation retreats, in moments of exhaustion so total that the mind finally stopped fighting. But they do not live there. They do not know the address. And the tragedy is not that they haven't tried. The tragedy is that they have been looking in every direction except one.
The problem of suffering, the radical, chronic dissatisfaction that hides underneath every human life, is not a problem of inadequate effort, insufficient success, or unlucky circumstances. Most people believe that suffering is the result of having the wrong things, being in the wrong situation, being around the wrong people. Fix the external, they think, and the internal will follow. Get the promotion, find the partner, move to the better city, achieve the smaller waistline, and peace will arrive like a package you finally ordered correctly. But here is what no one tells you at the productivity seminar, at the therapy appointment, at the success conference where everyone wears lanyards and talks about disruption. The suffering does not stop when the external circumstances improve. It shapeshifts, it migrates, it finds new furniture to inhabit. You get the promotion and discover an ambient anxiety you didn't have before. You find the partner and discover a new fear, the fear of losing them. You arrive at every destination you ever wanted and find that somehow, inexplicably, the destination was not enough.
This is not a modern problem. This is the oldest human problem. And the man who cracked it open, not with philosophy written from the comfort of a university chair, not with theology assembled by committee, but with his own skin, his own starvation, his own long dark nights beneath foreign trees, that man was a prince who gave everything away. Today, we are going to excavate that story, not the sanitized tourist brochure version, not the golden statue version, the real one, bloody and radically human, the one that lives inside a collection of ancient texts called the Pali Canon, the earliest written record of what Siddhartha Gautama actually said and actually did. We are going to walk his path. We are going to feel the moments where he almost gave up, and we are going to understand, with the precision of neuroscience and the depth of philosophy, why what he discovered under a tree in northern India 2,500 years ago is not only still relevant, it is the most urgent answer to the most urgent question of our time.
Once you understand this story, really understand it, not as biography, but as mirror, it will completely transform how you relate to your own suffering. Not by removing the chaos from your life, but by removing the chaos from your relationship with your life. And that, as you will see, is the only freedom that has ever actually existed. Before we go any further, I want to sit with you for one moment in this question. What is the difference between a mind in pain and a mind at peace when the external circumstances are identical? Because that question, deceptively simple, devastatingly deep, is the entire engine of everything we are about to explore.
Root origins, the world that made Siddhartha. To understand why Prince Siddhartha's story is not merely an ancient religious biography, but a map for the human condition, we need to understand the world he was born into. because his world, in all the ways that matter most, is not so different from ours. The 6th century BCE in northern India was, in the language of physicists, a system in far from equilibrium conditions. The old Brahminical order, the rigid, caste-locked hierarchy of Vedic society, where your spiritual fate was determined by the accident of your birth, was beginning to fracture under the pressure of new urban economies, the rise of merchant classes, political consolidation under emerging kingdoms, and a restless intellectual climate where wandering thinkers, called Shramanas, were challenging every assumption that the established order considered sacred. It was an era of radical disruption. It was an era very much like now.
Into this world, into the Shakya clan of the Kshatriya warrior nobility near what is today southern Nepal, a boy was born. His father was King Suddhodana, and shortly after the birth, the king invited 8 Brahmin scholars to read the child's destiny. 7 of them hedged. They said the boy carried dual potential. He would either become a Chakravartin, a world-unifying king of extraordinary power, or he would become a Buddha, a fully awakened being. One Brahmin, a young man named Kaundinya, whose name we will encounter again at the end of this story, made no such hedge. He held up a single finger. "This child will renounce the world," he said. "This child will become the Buddha." King Suddhodana, a man who had spent his life building power, was not interested in his son becoming a wandering mystic. He made a decision that any ambitious parent might recognize. He would eliminate the conditions that might provoke renunciation. He surrounded the boy, named Siddhartha, meaning he who achieves his aim, with every conceivable pleasure and shield. 3 palaces for 3 seasons, servants whose sole purpose was entertainment, a wall of beauty, music, and abundance so total that the young prince would never have cause to wonder what lay beyond it. Youth eternal, pressed in around him like cotton wool.
This is a strategy every culture still employs, in more sophisticated forms. We call it comfort. We call it success. We call it providing for the next generation. We build environments so saturated with stimulation that the deep questions, the ones that surface in silence, never have room to breathe. Suddhodana was not being cruel. He was being the most efficient parent in the history of civilization, constructing a pharmaceutical-grade hedge against his son's dissatisfaction. It didn't work. Of course it didn't work, because the suffering that the Pali Canon calls dukkha, a word richer and more textured than its usual translation of suffering, encompassing also unsatisfactoriness, impermanence, the subtle structural ache of conditioned existence, dukkha is not a product of external circumstances. It is a product of the structure of consciousness meeting the structure of reality. You can no more insulate someone from dukkha by surrounding them with beauty than you can insulate them from gravity by giving them a comfortable chair. The conflict, when the bubble breaks. Here is where the story turns, and where it turns into your story as well. Wait, have you ever experienced this? That moment when something you cannot name, some restlessness deeper than boredom, some hunger that no meal has ever satisfied, that thing surfaced through all the noise and comfort of your ordinary life and asked you, with the quiet devastation of a door opening onto a cold morning, "Is this it? Is this all there is?" Siddhartha was 29 years old. By every measurable standard, his life was exceptional. He had a wife named Yasodhara, whom tradition describes as one of the great beauties of the region, a woman of intelligence and warmth. He had just become a father, a son named Rahula, which means fetter or bond. That name is not coincidental. It is remembered in the texts precisely because it tells us something. Siddhartha was already aware at the moment of his son's birth that the deepest attachments of a human life are inseparable from the deepest vulnerabilities. To love something is to be exposed to its loss. To be born is to begin dying. And then came what the tradition calls the four sights, and what we might call, in more contemporary language, four reality intrusions.
On a journey outside the palace walls, the story tells us the king had tried to beautify and clear the route, staging a kind of managed experience, an ancient public relations exercise. Siddhartha saw an old man, bent and trembling, time written in deep lines across a body that had once been young. Siddhartha's charioteer, Channa, told him what he was seeing. This, the charioteer said, is what happens to all beings, all of us, without exception. The prince, who had been architecturally insulated from this fact, was now simply and irreversibly informed of it. Aging is universal. Then he saw a man racked with illness, the body turned against itself, suffering from the inside out. Then he saw a corpse being carried to cremation, surrounded by wailing, the absolute finality of biological cessation placed before him without anesthesia. Death is universal.
And then, and this is the pivot that changes everything, he saw a wandering ascetic, a shramana, a man who had given up everything and was walking through the world with a face of inexplicable stillness. Siddhartha stared at that face, not the face of someone who had solved his problems, the face of someone who had stopped fighting reality and found in that cessation of struggle something that looked remarkably like freedom. These encounters, which the Pali Canon places most directly in the biography of the previous Buddha Vipassi in the Mahapadana Sutta, but which tradition has always understood to reflect the pattern of Siddhartha's own awakening, these encounters are not just ancient myth, they are a phenomenology of awakening. Cognitive science gives us a term for what happened to Siddhartha, a schema violation. His entire cognitive framework, the deep implicit map his mind had built of reality, a map in which youth and health and beauty were permanent and available, was shattered by direct evidence. The brain, encountering a schema violation of sufficient force, does not simply update the old belief. It enters a crisis state. And crisis, when it cannot be suppressed, becomes a search.
This is the fracture that begins every genuine awakening. Not the pleasant unfolding of a yoga retreat, but the rupture of a comfortable lie. The world teaches us that peace lies at the end of more achievement, more love, more security, more control. The Dharma truth, the truth Siddhartha was about to stake his life on discovering, is that this direction is precisely wrong. Every step toward more of what the world offers is a step away from the only peace that has ever existed. That is the collision at the heart of this story. Raw instinct says, secure the palace, build higher walls. Awakened intelligence says, the walls are the problem. Main point 1. The Great Departure, the courage to leave. On a night in the month of Ashada, with a full moon hanging over the palace of Kapilavastu like a witness, Siddhartha made the decision that would define the next 2,500 years of human spiritual inquiry. He went to the chamber where Yasodhara slept with their newborn son. The accounts in the tradition tell us he stood in the doorway. He wanted to hold his son one last time. He lifted his hand toward the sleeping form, then stopped. If I disturb them, he thought, she will wake, and if she wakes, I may not have the strength to leave. He turned and walked out. This moment is extraordinary, not because it is a story of cold detachment, but because it is a story of almost unbearable love, choosing something beyond itself. Siddhartha was not leaving because he did not care. He was leaving precisely because he cared, about something larger than his own happiness,
about a question that, once seen, could not be unseen. Why is there suffering? And is there a way out that is not just an escape into a different form of suffering?
He summoned his horse Kantaka and his groom Chana. They rode out through the sleeping city, and the texts record that the gates opened before them as if the universe itself was participating. Perhaps it was. Perhaps what looks like miraculous intervention is simply the description of a mind whose clarity had become so total that every obstacle dissolved before it. He crossed the Anoma River, removed his princely garments, cut his hair, handed his possessions to Chana, and sent him back. The Great Renunciation, in Pali, Mahabhinishkama. Now this is where many Western listeners may feel the story becoming strange. Why give everything up? What is spiritually virtuous about poverty? Why couldn't he have achieved awakening while keeping his palace, his wife, his child? This is a legitimate and important question, and the answer is not what most people assume. The science of radical commitment, what physics, biology, and the Pali Canon agree on.
Siddhartha was not rejecting the world because the world was evil. He was applying what we might now call a cognitive isolation protocol. In neuroscience, the principle of selective attention tells us that the brain can only achieve deep penetrative processing when it removes competing stimuli. The prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for long-range planning, moral reasoning, and the capacity to hold contradictory truths simultaneously, requires conditions of quiet, stability, and freedom from threat to operate at its highest register. Every luxury of the palace was also, in neurological terms, a competing input. Every responsibility, father, prince, future king, was a cognitive load, pulling attention away from the one question Siddhartha needed to answer with every available resource. But there is a deeper principle here, one the Pali Canon states with stark precision in the Arya-Pariyesana Sutta, the discourse on the noble search. The Buddha, recalling this period of his life, articulated something so clean and so devastating that it deserves to be quoted in its essence. It makes no sense to seek the end of birth, aging, and death by attaching ourselves to things that are themselves subject to birth, aging, and death. A man drowning does not look for a lifeline made of water. A mind trapped in impermanence cannot find literation by grasping more impermanence and hoping it adds up to permanence.
This is what Siddhartha understood with the precision of a physicist examining a system. Every solution the world offered was made of the same material as the problem. Wealth is impermanent. Status is impermanent. Relationships, however beautiful, however sacred, are subject to the same erosion as stones in a river. To seek the permanent within the impermanent is not strategy, it is category error. And the renunciation was not the act of a man rejecting life, but the act of a man committed enough to life's most fundamental question that he refused to settle for approximate answers. The Two Teachers, a case study in spiritual epistemology. Siddhartha did not wander into the forest without a map. He did what any intelligent seeker would do. He found the best teachers available. The first was Alara Kalama, a renowned meditation master whose lineage traced back through generations of Vedic contemplatives. Under Alara's guidance, Siddhartha demonstrated a facility for meditative absorption that alarmed even his teacher. In weeks, he had mastered what it took others years to access. He reached what the tradition describes as the sphere of nothingness, a state of consciousness so refined, so stripped of ordinary mental content, that most practitioners considered it the threshold of liberation. Alara Kalama was moved. He offered Siddhartha co-leadership of the community. Here, he said, is a man who has understood what I have understood. But Siddhartha refused.
This refusal is one of the most epistemologically significant moments in the history of human thought, and the Buddha himself recounts it in the Pariyesana Sutta. He refused because, in the stillness of that rarefied state, he noticed something. He noticed that the state, however sublime, was still a state. It arose, and what arises passes. The sphere of nothingness was a profound achievement of concentration, but it was not liberation from the conditions of existence. It was a temporary suspension of them. When the meditation ended, the ordinary mind, with its hunger and fear and longing, reassembled itself. Nothingness, it turned out, was another experience, and experiences end. He moved on to a second teacher, Uddaka Ramaputta, son of the master Rama, who taught a state described as neither perception nor non-perception, a condition of consciousness so attenuated that even the recognition of absence had been transcended. And again, Siddhartha mastered it, and again he recognized that however high the altitude of this state, it remained within the domain of conditioned phenomena. It was the penultimate floor of the building, not the exit.
What makes this case study so remarkable is its parallel in modern cognitive science. Contemporary researchers studying meditative states, including neuroscientist Richard Davidson at the University of Wisconsin and others working in contemplative neuroscience, have confirmed that advanced meditative absorption produces measurable and distinctive patterns of neural activity, including gamma wave synchronization and increased activity in the prefrontal cortex. These are real and significant states. But none of them, including the deepest, constitute permanent structural transformation of the reactive patterns that generate suffering. State experiences and trait transformations are different categories of achievement. Siddhartha, working only with the laboratory of his own mind, without fMRI machines or peer review, had arrived at this same conclusion with uncanny precision. He left Uddaka's community. He was, by the account of the texts, alone.
This is critically important for where you are right now in your own life. Most of us have our version of Alara Kalama and Uddaka Ramaputta. We have found practices, philosophies, relationships, or achievements that genuinely elevate our state of mind. Therapy that brings real insight. Meditation that produces real calm. Career success that produces real satisfaction. And then, and here is the moment most people misread, the state fades. The insight doesn't hold under pressure. The calm dissolves when the boss sends an unreasonable email. The satisfaction curdles into the hunger for more. The near universal response to this moment is to conclude that we failed, or that the practice failed, or that we need a better version of the same thing, more sessions, a more advanced teacher, a bigger achievement. What Siddhartha's discernment teaches us is a different interpretation entirely. Perhaps the state was always temporary, not because something went wrong, but because no accumulated state can touch the structural root. The suffering doesn't come from the absence of positive experiences. It comes from the architecture of a mind that was never examined at its foundations. Progress check. So far, we have established that Siddhartha's search was not a crisis of circumstance, but a crisis of insight. The recognition that no external arrangement, however optimal, addresses the structural source of human suffering. He left two of the greatest teachers of his era, not because they were wrong, but because they were pointing at the penultimate floor when he needed the exit. Now we arrive at the crucible.
Main point 2. The crucible. 6 years in the fire. After leaving Uddaka Ramaputta, Siddhartha joined a group of 5 ascetics in the forest of Uruvela near the Naranjara River. These men, the most extreme practitioners of their era, believed that the body was the enemy of enlightenment and that liberation came through the total subjugation of physical desire. They starved themselves, they practiced breath retention until they fainted, they slept on beds of thorns, they lived in the open air through monsoon and drought. It was the spiritual equivalent of what modern athletes call overtraining, taken to its ultimate, punishing conclusion. And Siddhartha, with the same terrifying intensity he brought to everything, surpassed them all. The texts describe him reducing his food intake to a single grain of rice per day. His body became, in the poetic language of the tradition, like a withered vine, like a series of knots, his eyes sunken into his skull like stars reflected in a dry well. He had transformed himself into the most rigorous empirical test of a hypothesis that the body, sufficiently denied, will surrender its grip on the mind. Wait, there is one more thing that matters deeply here, because it connects directly to something you may have tried in your own life. This phase of Siddhartha's journey is not simply ancient history, it is the first great experiment in what we now call the mind-body problem, the relationship between physical experience and consciousness, between biological state and the possibility of freedom. Modern neuroscience is instructive here. Research on extreme caloric restriction and physical stress consistently shows that below certain metabolic thresholds, the prefrontal cortex, the very cognitive structure needed for deep insight, is progressively compromised. The brain's most sophisticated functions are the first to go when resources become scarce. What Siddhartha was doing, from a purely biological standpoint, was systematically destroying the instrument he needed to solve the problem he was trying to solve. The ascetic path was, neurologically speaking, a method of producing maximum suffering in the pursuit of its elimination, a locked door with the key hidden inside.
And then came the moment. A young woman named Sujata, some accounts name her differently, but the Pali tradition is consistent on the essence, came to the riverbank where Siddhartha sat, barely alive, a skeleton draped in the rags of his former robes. She had prepared an offering of milk rice, kheer, a simple and nourishing food. She offered it to him, and Siddhartha, after 6 years of systematic self-mortification, accepted it. This act, the acceptance of nourishment, was as radical in its context as anything that came before it. The 5 ascetics who had been his companions watched in horror and disgust. He had broken the code. He had surrendered to the body. They turned away from him and left. He had lost his spiritual community, his method, and 6 years of extraordinary effort in a single bowl of rice. But Siddhartha had understood something they had not. The body is not the enemy of mind. The body is its instrument, and an instrument that is damaged beyond function cannot produce the music you are searching for. He ate the rice. He walked to the Bodhi tree. He sat down.
This is the middle way, the Majjhima Patipada, that the Buddha would later describe as the cornerstone of his entire teaching. Not the indulgence of every appetite, not the mortification of every desire, but the calibrated and intelligent engagement with physical and mental life that keeps the instrument tuned and the practitioner alert. In the language of behavioral economics, it is the rejection of both hyperbolic discounting, choosing immediate pleasure at the cost of long-term well-being, and punishing over-optimization, sacrificing all present function for an imagined future liberation. It is, in the language of systems theory, the path of sustainable optimization. Extreme states are self-defeating. The middle is where the signal is clearest. The night under the Bodhi tree, consciousness at the edge of everything. Now we arrive at the night that changed the world, and I want you to sit with the magnitude of what I am about to describe. not as mythology, as phenomenology. Siddhartha sat under a fig tree, the Ficus religiosa, which would thereafter be called the Bodhi tree, the tree of awakening, on the banks of the Naranjara River in what is now Bodh Gaya, India. He made a resolution that the texts record with almost shocking directness. He would not rise from this spot until he had found the answer. Flesh may wither, bones may dissolve, he would not move.
This is the night that the tradition describes with extraordinary symbolism, the assault of Mara, the personification of everything that sedimces and terrorizes the mind: desire, fear, doubt, the armies of distraction and self-preservation. We need not literalize these figures to grasp their truth. Mara is the name for what happens when a mind trained to extraordinary sensitivity is finally forced to confront, without escape or distraction, every pattern of craving and aversion that it contains. When there is nowhere else to go and nothing else to do, the full horror and beauty of what a human mind actually contains becomes visible. Siddhartha did not fight Mara. This is crucial. He did not suppress the desires. He did not overcome the fears. He looked at them. He witnessed them with a clarity so total, what the tradition calls sampajana, clear comprehension, that they could no longer operate as they had operated when the mind was busy running away from them. A wave that no longer crashes against a shore doesn't disappear, it simply spends itself.
By dawn, tradition tells us something fundamental had shifted. The texts from the Arya Pariyasana Sutta describe it this way: he had attained the unborn, the unaging, the unailing, the deathless, not as states entered and exited, but as the recognition of something already present underneath every state, every condition, every arising and passing. The word the Pali Canon uses for this is nibbana, and whatever metaphysical weight you choose to give it, its functional description is precise: the extinguishing of the fires of craving, aversion, and delusion that had been consuming human consciousness from the inside. The Buddha's declaration upon awakening, as recorded in the Pali Canon, is one of the most audacious statements in human intellectual history. My deliverance is unshakable. This is my last birth. Now there is no renewal of being. Not whispered, not tentative, stated with the confidence of someone who has just confirmed an experiment they had been running for a lifetime.
From the neuroscientific perspective, the accounts describe is consistent with what researchers now call a fundamental reorganization of the default mode network, the constellation of brain regions responsible for self-referential thinking, rumination, and the generation of the narrative self. Studies of long-term meditators show structural and functional changes in these networks that correlate with reduced reactivity, increased equanimity, and what researchers describe as a kind of decentering from the experience of self as a fixed, threatened entity. What Siddhartha achieved was not the destruction of the self, but the transparent recognition of what the self actually is: a process, not a thing; a verb, not a noun.
Main point 3. The reluctance to teach and the wheel that turned the world. Here is a moment in the story that most popular accounts omit, and it may be the most humanly significant moment of all. After the awakening under the Bodhi tree, the newly enlightened Siddhartha, now the Buddha, the awakened one, remained near the tree for what tradition describes as 49 days, and during this period the texts record in the Aryappa Pariyasana Sutta that he was inclined not to teach. This is extraordinary. The man who had just achieved what he had spent decades searching for, whose insight had the potential to liberate the suffering of countless beings, this man almost didn't tell anyone.
Why? The text is direct about his reasoning. The Dharma he had realized was subtle, deep, difficult to perceive, going against the worldly stream. And the world, he observed, was dyed in attachment, saturated in the pleasures and distractions of ordinary life. To offer this teaching to minds not yet ripe for it, minds not yet cracked open by the right kind of suffering, would be like trying to explain the mathematics of general relativity to someone who had not yet learned arithmetic, not from condescension, but from sorrow at the effort wasted and the frustration generated. What changed his mind is told through the image of Brahma Sahampati appearing before him and appealing, not to his ego, but to his compassion, telling him that there are beings with only a little dust in their eyes, and that without the teaching they will be lost. Some flowers, Brahma says, bloom on their own, but most need someone to bring the rain. Whether you receive this as literal cosmology or as a metaphor for the inner dialogue between the part of the Buddha that feared futility and the part that knew with absolute clarity that teaching was not optional, the result was the same. The Buddha decided to teach, and he began with the 5 ascetics who had abandoned him at the riverbank when he accepted the rice.
He walked from Bodh Gaya to the deer park at Isipatana near Varanasi, a journey of roughly 200 kilometers on foot. He found his former companions. They saw him coming, and remembering his supposed surrender to sensuality, they agreed among themselves not to pay him proper respect. But as he came closer, something happened, something in the quality of his presence, in the way he moved, in the stillness of his expression, in the force field of a mind that had ceased to be at war with itself, overrode their decision. They stood, they welcomed him. And then came the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, the setting in motion of the wheel of Dharma. This sermon, preserved in the Samyutta Nikaya, SN 56.11 of the Pali Canon, is the most consequential lecture in the history of human thought. And its opening is not mysticism. Its opening is an almost forensically precise diagnosis of the human condition.
The Buddha began not with cosmology, not with theology, not with a declaration of his own divinity. He began with the middle way, the recognition that liberation cannot be found at either extreme of sensual indulgence or punishing self-denial. He was, in modern terms, delivering the first evidence-based therapeutic intervention in history. I have tested both extremes myself. Here is what the data showed. Then came the 4 noble truths: dukkha, suffering, unsatisfactoriness, the structural ache of conditioned existence; samudaya, the arising, the cause, which is tanha, craving, the relentless grasping for more experience, the compulsive reaching toward pleasure, and the compulsive fleeing from pain; nirodha, the cessation, that this craving, when it is fully understood and released, does not produce emptiness, but produces the end of what was generating the suffering; and magga, the path, the noble 8-fold path, the practical, livable, integrated program of right understanding, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration that makes this cessation not just a concept, but an achievement.
This is not theology. This is diagnostic medicine. Identify the disease, identify the cause, confirm that the cause, when removed, removes the disease, prescribe the treatment. A doctor in a modern hospital would recognize the structure immediately. What the Buddha was saying, with the precision of a physicist and the compassion of a parent, is this: you are suffering not because you have failed to accumulate enough, not because the wrong things have happened to you, but because the mind has a structural misunderstanding about the nature of reality, a misunderstanding so deep and so habitual that it feels like common sense.
It tells you that there is a permanent, fixed self that needs to be protected and satisfied, and it tells you that the world contains permanent, fixed objects of satisfaction that can fulfill that self. Both propositions are false, and the suffering is the consequence of acting as if they were true.
This is not pessimism. This is not nihilism. The Buddha did not say life is suffering and therefore worthless. He said life contains suffering, and I know its cause, and the cause can be addressed, and here is how. It is the most optimistic thing anyone has ever said, because it implies that the suffering is not inevitable. It is conditional, and conditions can be changed. At the end of this sermon, tradition records that Kondanya, the very Brahmin who had predicted decades earlier that this child would become a Buddha, attained stream entry. He saw the Dhamma. And the Buddha said, with what reads in the texts like an almost tender satisfaction, Kondanya has understood. Kondanya has understood.
The wheel had turned, addressing the objection, but my suffering has real external causes. This is the moment where the intelligent, questioning listener raises a hand, and I want to honor that objection fully, because it is a good one. The objection goes like this: my suffering has real external causes. I am in debt because of systemic inequality. My relationship is broken because my partner is genuinely harmful. My anxiety is biological. My depression is chemical. I am not suffering because of a philosophical misunderstanding. I am suffering because of real things that are actually happening. This objection is correct, and it does not contradict the Dharma. The Buddha never said external conditions are irrelevant. The Pali Canon's engagement with social justice, with right livelihood, with the alleviation of poverty, and the critique of unjust hierarchy is extensive and unambiguous. The Buddha understood structural causes. He had, after all, come from the most privileged structural position available, and found suffering even there.
But the teaching makes a distinction that our culture consistently collapses, the distinction between pain, which is the inevitable response to difficult conditions, and suffering, which is the additional layer of resistance, narrative, self-reference, and craving that the mind wraps around pain. Pain says, this is hard. Suffering says, this is hard and it shouldn't be, and if I were different, it wouldn't be. And I am failing because it is, and it will always be this way, and I am fundamentally broken. The pain may be real and caused by real conditions. The suffering is substantially a product of the mind's relationship to the pain. Behavioral economics research on what psychologists call the negativity bias, our brain's evolutionary tendency to weight negative experience more heavily than positive, to run scenarios of threat even in the absence of actual threat, to generalize from single negative experiences to global negative conclusions, confirms what the Pali Canon described in the language of tanha and upadana, craving and clinging. The structural tendency of the mind toward aversive reactivity is not a moral failing, it is an evolutionary inheritance. And like all evolutionary inheritances, it can be examined, understood, and worked with. That examination is the path.
Main point 4. Finding peace in chaos. The teaching that survives everything. This next part is critically important, and I want you to stay with me here. The Buddha taught for 45 years after his enlightenment. He walked the roads of northern India through monsoon and drought, through political upheaval and the deaths of his closest companions. He watched his Sangha, his community of practitioners, experience the full range of human drama, jealousy, schism, betrayal, illness, grief. He outlived friends. He received death threats. He was slandered by political rivals who hired people to spread false accusations. He watched a man named Devadatta, his own cousin, his own ordained disciple, attempt to murder him and seize control of the Sangha. And through all of it, the texts record a consistent quality of presence that the Pali word upekkha tries to capture: equanimity. Not indifference, not distance, not the cold detachment of someone who has stopped caring. Equanimity as the quality of a mind so stable in its understanding of impermanence that nothing, not joy, not grief, not threat, not loss, can dislodge it from its center. Like a deep ocean, a storm can rage across the surface. The depths remain. This is what finding peace in chaos actually means in the Dharma tradition, and it is radically different from what most people imagine. It is not the elimination of chaos. The world will always produce chaos. That is among the most reliable predictions in the history of human observation. It is not the achievement of a state of calm that must be maintained by controlling your environment and keeping difficult things away. It is the cultivation of a relationship to experience so clear, so deeply informed by the understanding of impermanence and the nature of mind, that chaos loses its power to generate suffering.
The contemporary neuroscientist and mindfulness researcher John Cobb-Zinn, building on decades of empirical research, has framed this as a distinction between reacting and responding. The reactive mind is run by evolutionary automation, by the amygdala's threat detection system firing before the prefrontal cortex has had time to provide context. The responding mind is not slower, but it has developed through practice, through the cultivation of what the Pali Canon calls sati, mindfulness, a gap between stimulus and response in which intelligence can operate. In that gap, the Dharma lives. The Buddha's life, examined honestly, was not peaceful in the ordinary sense. It was full of difficulty. What was peaceful was the mind in which all that difficulty was held. And the only way to that quality of mind, this is the part that no shortcut can circumvent, is the practice of looking directly, with sustained attention and without flinching, at the nature of your own experience.
Let us gather what we have walked through today. We began with the problem that every human life eventually faces: the discovery that no arrangement of external circumstances, however optimal, eliminates the fundamental unsatisfactoriness that lives inside conditioned existence. We traced this problem back to its source, not through self-criticism or despair, but through the lens of one extraordinary life, a prince who had everything, and recognized, with the precision of a physicist looking at a flawed model, that everything was built on a structural error. We followed Siddhartha through the great renunciation, not as an act of rejection, but as an act of radical commitment to the only question that mattered. We saw him master two of the greatest teachers of his era, and then, with the epistemological courage of a genuine empiricist, recognize that their answers, however elevated, were still made of the same material as the problem. We saw him enter the fire of extreme asceticism, push his body to its biological limits, and discover that the middle way was not a compromise, but a revelation.
We sat with him under the Bodhi tree and understood, through the language of neuroscience, phenomenology, and the direct account of the Pali Canon, what the awakening actually was. Not the acquisition of a supernatural state, but the structural reorganization of the mind's relationship to experience. The recognition of what had always been true, now without obstruction.
and we heard the wheel turn at the deer park, the Four Noble Truths delivered not as theology, but as diagnostic medicine, the most precise and compassionate description of the human condition ever articulated, and a practical prescription that has been confirmed over and over in the laboratories of human experience across 2,500 years. Core message? Peace is not the absence of chaos. Peace is the quality of the mind that holds chaos without being destroyed by it. And that mind is not a gift or an accident. It is a practice, a direction, and a choice that is available to you right now.
Action steps. Here is where we move from understanding to living. Because Dharma that stays in the intellect is, as the Pali Canon would say, like a beautiful lamp that no one has bothered to light. Step 1. See the 4 sights. Not literally, though you will encounter them soon enough, but begin to notice, this week, the moments when reality intrudes on your preferred narrative. When you encounter evidence of impermanence, in your body, in your relationships, in the world around you, instead of flinching away, stay for one breath longer. Let the fact of impermanence land. This is not pessimism. This is the first act of genuine intelligence about your own life. Step 2. Name the craving. In whatever form of suffering is most present in your life right now, anxiety, frustration, longing, resentment, spend 5 minutes each day asking a single question. What am I expecting that is different from what is actually here? Where is the gap between my demand that reality be otherwise and what reality actually is? You do not need to fix the gap immediately. Simply naming it with honesty is already a significant act of freedom.
Step 3. Practice the middle way in one specific area of your life. Choose one domain, your work rhythm, your eating, your relationship to your phone or social media, your exercise, and identify the place where you have been operating at an extreme, either total indulgence or punishing self-denial. Introduce one adjustment toward the middle. Not because the middle is mediocre, but because the middle is where the instrument stays tuned, where the signal is clearest, where practice becomes sustainable, and sustainable practice becomes transformation. Start with whichever step feels right, but what matters most is that you begin. Not when the circumstances are ideal, not when you have more time, more money, more stability. Now. The Bodhi tree is available in this moment. The awakening was never waiting for the right conditions. It was waiting for the right direction.
I want to hear from you. In the comments, tell me, which of these 3 steps will you begin with? Which part of Siddhartha's story landed most deeply, and why? Because Dharma is not a spectator sport. It is a conversation between your life and the truth of your experience. And this community is one of the places where that conversation can happen. If this episode moved something in you, subscribe so that this conversation continues. The next awakening is already waiting for you.
The final epiphany. Here is something that astronomers discovered that the Buddha knew, though they arrived at it by completely different roads. There is a phenomenon in astrophysics called the cosmic background radiation, a faint, pervasive glow that fills the entire observable universe, the residual warmth of the first light that ever existed, still present everywhere, still present right now, in the air between your fingertips as you sit and listen to these words. It is not a memory of that original light. It is that original light, still here, distributed across the entire expanse of what exists. The universe did not leave its source behind. It carried it forward, woven into the fabric of everything that came after. The Buddha discovered something structurally identical mapped onto the territory of consciousness. Underneath every layer of craving, every wave of aversion, every story the mind tells about itself, underneath the fear and the longing and the brilliant, complicated noise of a human life, there is something that was not created by any of it and is not damaged by any of it. The Pali Canon points toward it with the word nibbana, the blowing out of the fires. But unlike so many attempts to name the absolute, this word does not describe an addition, it describes a subtraction, the removal of the obstruction. And when the obstruction is removed, what remains is not emptiness, it is the background warmth that was there all along, already present, already complete, never actually threatened. Imagine a river at the moment just before dawn. The surface is dark and moving, carrying everything the night has given it, leaves, ripples, the reflections of stars beginning to pale. And then the sun, not dramatically, not with fanfare, but with the absolute inevitability of every sunrise that has ever happened, begins to arrive. The river does not change. The water continues its flowing. The carrying continues. But now everything it carries is luminous. The same river, the same cargo, and yet completely and irreversibly transformed by the light that was always coming. That is what awakening is. Not the absence of the river's movement, not the elimination of what the river carries, but the arrival of a light that makes every bit of it, the grief, the joy, the ordinary Tuesday morning, the catastrophic loss, the quiet kindness of a stranger, visible, held, understood, and somehow, inexplicably, enough.
Siddhartha walked out of his palace into the chaos of a world that was aging, sick, and dying. He did not find peace by making it less chaotic. He found peace by understanding what chaos is made of, by going so deeply into the nature of experience that the thing which had been generating suffering revealed itself clearly, like a mechanism visible at last in the light. And then, like smoke that has no fuel left to feed it, the suffering ceased. Not because life became easier, because he stopped fighting the terms of life. Because he recognized in the deepest possible way that the storm and the stillness were never separate, that the chaos was always, underneath its noise, a form of the same river flowing in the same direction, toward dawn, toward the light that was always arriving. The peace you have been searching for is not waiting at the end of your striving. It is the nature of what you already are, hidden under the noise of everything you have been told you should want instead.